40 days from Passover.
Oh,
From,
Ascension Thursday.
yeah.
All right. That's awesome. Very cool.
Yeah.
So-
we got 10 days until Pentecost. Or Shavuot.
Yes, 10 days to Pentecost. Yeah, in fact, one of the most interesting things that's not talked about is the ascension. Not in apologetics or not in theological circles. It's just not a big topic, but it's kind of a big deal, you know? Jesus just disappearing and vanishing into heaven, essentially. That's pretty amazing stuff. So, unfortunately, we're not going to talk about that tonight, but it's a good segue. I'd like to introduce this topic, the rest of what we're going to be talking about tonight, though, with some questions for the class. But before we do that, let's just quickly pray and ask God to join us. Father, we invite your presence here, and we ask that you would come and be a part of what's going on in this room and in our minds and in our hearts, God. We ask that you would move us closer towards you and change us in the process. In Jesus' name, amen. So here's a question for you. There's a lot of really smart folks in here, and I know that some of us have studied this material in the past. So I just wanted to get some things from you. If you could tell me what a fact is, I'd really appreciate it. What's a fact? What's a fact? What makes a fact?
It's something that's proven. It's a concept that has been proven by separate means,
Okay.
and it has no, there's no way you can refute it.
Okay. All right. Other definitions or ideas, descriptions of what a fact is? It's objective. That's a good descriptive word for it. Objective, yes. Meaning it's not subjective. It doesn't depend on one's own perspective. Yeah, Wayne.
It's verifiable truth.
Verifiable truth.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Good.
Verifiable truth, objective, something that's proven. Sophia.
How about valid information?
Valid information. Valid information. Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, other thoughts on facts? Here's a question. How do you get a fact? How does one arrive at a fact? How does the human population arrive at a fact or determine that something is a fact? Yeah.
Something that would be apparent to the majority of people. It would be a common knowledge in that sense.
Okay.
I disagree with that.
You disagree with that? Why do you disagree?
Because knowledge is not truth. Knowledge is what you believe. For instance, President Bush believed there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And he knew it because of all the information he had, and they went in and he was wrong. So knowledge is what you believe, and facts are not just apparent, they are the real thing, truth.
They're objective.
Someone said verifiable truth,
Yeah.
and there's a big difference between knowledge and truth.
Okay, let's come back to this idea here. And you said again something that
Something
people
that's apparent.
apparent to a lot of people.
But that could be interpreted as knowledge.
Okay.
Something might be apparent and may not be fact, that it should have been based on verifiable proof.
I see. That is a really, I think we're really starting to get closer to the issue here. There's something that is verifiable out there apart from the human mind or the human intellect. It's objective in that sense. Other people can think about it certain ways, have different perspectives on it, but it's independent of a mind thinking about it. And it's something we can maybe examine, test, maybe approach and reapproach at different times and different ways and methods. And there's different people that come across it throughout maybe the years, like gravity or light, things like this. So when you have a fact, you have facts of science. People talk about facts of history. But what if I was to tell you that there really is no such thing as a fact? What if you were to think that facts don't exist?
Is that a fact?
You get a laser in your eye. No, that's a great question. These are great questions. But I wonder if, when we're talking about scientific facts and historical facts, what if I was to tell you that maybe it's possible that there is no such thing as facts?
I don't know.
Let's go here, Wayne.
Okay, what you're saying is there is no absolute truth. That's what a fact is. Absolute truth. You know, what as a human, what I approximate it with is real science. When I want to prove something, I set up an experimental design. I have to have a reproducible criterion that tests something. And when it always points to the same answer, that's as close as I can get to a fact. But can I, as a human, verify that something is absolutely, unequivocally true? I don't know. But if I can't, then there is no absolute truth at all.
Oh, interesting.
You have
Good.
a lot of mathematical facts that are true.
Okay. Okay.
That stretches it. This table, it's a fact that this table exists.
Okay. Let's go here.
Bear with me, I'm an elementary teacher, okay? So I have this cup, I put it on this table, everybody saw that, that's a fact, okay? If you're gonna redefine the word fact, okay, maybe call it something else, there's still this, we all saw that went on the table, that happened, that's what I would call a fact.
Yeah.
Now, you can call a fact something else and tell me whatever, but then what do I use to say that I did put that on the table, we all saw that really happened.
Yeah.
There were things that really did happen.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Good. This is really good. So you have, let's keep it facts of history, facts of science. Okay. So we're talking about that when we're talking about facts, because that's when most of the time when people use the word fact, they're not talking about kind of mundane sorts of things. They're like putting coffee here or there. But the point which you're getting at is great. What makes something a fact for historians is very different than what you and I think of when we hear the word fact. You and I think of something that is irrefutably true of the past, and there's no possible way it's not true. But historians don't think of facts that way. Historians have a much lower criteria for facts. And interestingly, in science, we'll talk about this in the scientific apologetics class. You can probably speak to this, Dr. John, that when you're talking about gravity being a fact of this planet and certain places around the universe, you're talking about something we have observed to be true over and over and over again. We haven't observed anti-gravity, for instance, on this planet.
Also, frame of reference is what, frame of reference, so everything has a frame of reference, though it is true.
Mm-hmm.
When Jesus said, I am the truth, he himself is the frame of reference, or
Right.
absolute truth. But
Yes.
The rest are all relative truth.
Right. So this is really interesting. How do we understand facts in science and facts in history as the professionals do? As a professional historian or professional scientist. They understand facts of science, for instance, to be something that we've understood to be true based on frequent and independent and ongoing observations. It has not been proven otherwise. It has not revealed to us differently. It's always been happening this way, so we're going to put the word fact on that observation, on that occurrence, on that event. We're going to call it fact. Gravity is a fact. But really what is happening here is that it's not impossible to be overcome. It just hasn't been observed in the past to have been overcome. So when they talk about laws of nature, right? Most of us think there's no possible way to resist or go against a law of nature. The laws of nature always have their way. And there's no possible way that a law of nature can be overcome. So in history, the same is true. Historians look across the room at a bunch of other historians, and they go read the academic journals that all their peers are writing across the world in the last, say, few hundred years, whatever. And they say, what does everybody else think about what happened way back then? Well, if the majority of all the scholars say XYZ took place, then we're going to call it fact. We're going to call it a fact of history because all of these scholars in here, except for maybe a few French scholars, all agree that this has happened. 75%, 80%, 85% of all these scholars think that this event took place, that the Israelites marched around Jericho, that Nebuchadnezzar had interactions with Daniel. All of these facts of history are considered facts to the layperson, irrefutable occurrences in events in the past that actually happened. But historians in academia differ on many, many things that we think of as facts. So what makes a fact a fact? Well, it turns out that people give fact the definition that we all understand and we all use. It's the academics saying that this is a fact, and everybody else moves along and says, oh, it's fact. It has to be that way. There's no possible way it could be otherwise. So what we're dealing with here when we're talking about the resurrection is a bunch of scholars that look at the New Testament and all those writings, and a bunch of scholars that look at the surrounding context in which the New Testament was written, and they determine, based on their research, based on their studies of the primary sources that were written back then, what took place. They write about it, other people read it, and they say, this must have happened because the scholars all agree. Now, what you've pointed out very observantly is to make the distinction between a subjective understanding of reality and the objective reality itself. And so when you're using the word fact, and when I use the word fact, we use it very sloppily. We're talking about what we think is the objective reality. Scholars are talking about their subjective appreciation or interpretation or understanding of events. And that's where they use the word fact. In fact, most scholars don't use the word fact. They usually say things like, this most likely took place, or it's highly improbable that this did not occur. And so fact is a word that typically we use very loosely and sloppily. And what we're really saying, if you really try to understand what we're trying to say when we use this word fact, is that it's highly probable that this took place, and in light of the alternative competing evidences or theories, we're holding to this position and we're saying it's a fact because the evidence points that way. So there's an interesting, weird dynamic between subjective understanding of the actual events, the objective events, and the objective events themselves, and how we use the word fact. So in this presentation here, when we're going to talk about facts in a moment, I'm going to use the word fact because I'm saying that the majority, in fact, far more than the majority, of Christian and non-Christian scholars hold to certain pieces of evidence as facts of history when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. So when you have a whole lot of scholars claiming these evidences as actual events in history, we are then at a privileged place to say that these are facts. So when we're talking about evidence and when we're talking about facts, in this particular presentation, I'm talking about the same thing. So, in your outline, there is a diagram on page 44 in the resurrection section. And if you can turn there, we're going to look at some pieces of evidences, some evidences that will help us work through this material. Sorry, page 39. Actually, we're going to get to the diagram in a second. Let's look at page 39. Now, these are the facts that alternative theories can't make sense of. Do you have that there?
Is this a tomb of
You
Jesus?
guys can show that. Yeah, we'll get to that diagram in a second on page 41. But let's talk about this real quick. These are the facts that alternative theories can't make sense of. And again, when I'm saying fact, I'm talking about evidences that scholars, more than the majority of scholars, agree upon. Fact number one, Jesus died by crucifixion. Again, scholars across the world, throughout the ages, have agreed that that evidence that we find in the Bible is true. So we are again at privilege to say this is a fact of history. Fact number two, Jesus was buried. Fact number three, Jesus' death caused the disciples to despair and mourn. Again, fact of history. Fact number four, the tomb was discovered to be empty a few days later. Now, there are some little line items there I've provided underneath to elaborate on that point. So we'll just skip down to fact number 5. Fact number 5, the disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus. This is huge. The disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus. Fact number 6, the disciples were transformed to mourners, as mourners to doubters, to bold proclaimers of a resurrection. The disciples were transformed. Again, scholars all agree on this. Fact number 7, the resurrection message was the central message of the first century, you can write in the word century there, preaching. The resurrection message was the central message of the first century preaching. Fact number 8, 50 days after the death and resurrection, the message was preached in Jerusalem where he was buried. Okay, we also know that to be a fact of history. Fact number 9, due to the preaching of this message, the church was birthed and grew. Due to the preaching of the resurrection message, the church began and started to grow. Fact number 10, Sunday became the primary day of worship. Again, not too many people are disputing these. I don't know of anybody, really. And fact number 11, James, who had been a skeptic, was converted when he had an experience of the resurrection, of the resurrected Jesus. You can write in there, when he had an experience of the resurrected Jesus. James was a skeptic, kind of like Thomas, because Jesus was his brother. What would it take for you to be convinced that your brother resurrected? Or was God himself? So naturally, James is a skeptic. Fact number 12, Paul, who had persecuted Christians, was converted by an appearance of the resurrected Jesus. So again, I don't know of any scholars who contest these facts. What do scholars do when they hear these facts or when they come across these facts in their research? Do they say these are not facts? No. What they do is they come up with alternative theories to explain the 12 facts. The scholars of history, the historians, are almost all in unanimous agreement on the facts that we just went over. Regardless of whether they believe the Bible is the inerrant, inspired Word of God. Regardless of all of these things, they understand these pieces of evidences to be facts of history, and they come up with alternative theories that explain away Jesus' resurrection. And what we're saying is that these alternative theories that liberal and that atheist and agnostic and skeptical scholars present, all of these theories have challenges to them that cannot be overcome. The challenges are so strong that these alternative theories can't survive. So what I'm going to direct your attention to now is in your outline on a couple pages over, there's a nice diagram. If you flip your page there, you could read it correctly. And I'll put it here on the screen as well if you don't have your outline. What we're dealing with when we're talking about the alternative theories scholars come up with, we're talking about a variety of theories. But mainly they can be categorized under two broader headings. One happens to start with this category, there's an occupied or empty tomb. So when we're talking about these alternative theories that scholars present, we're talking about the tomb of Jesus. Was it occupied or unoccupied after the preaching of the resurrection message? And if it was occupied, you get all of these theories. And if it was empty, you get all of these theories. So let's first look at these occupied theories. The tomb of Jesus was either occupied or empty. Let's start with occupied. And the first theory is the unknown tomb theory. Okay? This theory happens to be the theory where scholars present this idea that the disciples and Mary Magdalene and others went to the wrong tomb, didn't know the right tomb, and so they just made up the resurrection because they couldn't find the body. And then the wrong tomb theory is that they went to the wrong tomb and it found it to be empty, and so they made up the resurrection. And then another theory is the legend theory, that over time, the disciples created this tale that Jesus rose from the grave. Another theory is that Jesus had a twin. So this twin lived out in the desert, in the boonies for his whole life, 33 years out there, and after the crucifixion, he cruises into town, makes himself look like Jesus, or dresses up in what Jesus would have worn. And because he's his twin, he looks identical. And so he presents himself to the disciples as the resurrected Jesus. So apparently, a scholar from UC Berkeley presented this to Dr. William Lane Craig in a debate one time. And Craig actually uses it as a joke in other later talks he gives. Anyway, another theory for the occupied tomb. Again, the occupied, Jesus' body is still in the tomb. It's just that they're making up stuff related to this. The other one is a hallucination. Jesus' body, again, is in the grave, but the disciples all hallucinated that he rose again. The existential and spiritual resurrection theories are very interesting. The existential resurrection one is essentially something by a theologian named Rudolf Bultmann, who came to prominence about 50 years ago, and in the different liberal movements of the 50s and 60s, when existentialism was on the rise, he brought in some of that thinking into theology and said essentially that Jesus was raised in our hearts. And that's what the resurrection means. It's a personal, existential experience that you have with the resurrected Jesus in your heart. He appeals to you and appears to you in a resurrected form. So that's the existential theory. And the spiritual resurrection is that when Jesus resurrected, it was a spiritual resurrection. His body was still in the grave, the tomb was occupied, but he presented himself kind of in a ghostly manner to the disciples. And they had appearances of Jesus, but it was the ghost form of Jesus. So he was a spiritual appearance. They saw his spirit. So these are the occupied tomb theories. Now, the empty tomb theories recognize or start with the idea that Jesus is no longer in the tomb. His body is not in the tomb. And the tomb was, in fact, found empty. So how do you explain the rest of the facts? Okay, so this is what happens. You have either a natural account to explain the empty tomb and the appearances and all the facts, or a supernatural account. In the natural account, you have the disciples stole the body. So when the body was not in the tomb anymore, it was because the disciples took it out of the tomb. But Jesus is still dead. And you also have the authorities hid the body, meaning the Jews or the Romans took the body out of the tomb where Joseph of Arimathea put him, and they took the body and put him somewhere else. So Jesus is still dead, he's just not in the tomb. So then you have the swoon theory, and the swoon theory basically is the idea that Jesus never actually died on the cross. He wasn't actually dead when they took him down. They pierced a hole in his side, but he faked his death. They took him down early. Remember, the other thieves weren't dead yet, so maybe Jesus was also not dead yet. And they took him down early, put him in a tomb in a nice, safe, quiet place where he was no longer being beaten and suffering. And it was cool, and the tomb's cool, damp air in the cave would have revived him, especially when the women came and Joseph of Arimathea came to kind of put the cloths around him and maybe some ointments and some incense and things like this. That would have revived him in the tomb, and he would have then had energy to appear to the disciples later on. This is the swoon theory, that he swooned through the cross and essentially just needed to take a long nap to recover and keep going. The Passover plot, that one is a little tricky. I can't remember all the details of it, but it's in your outline there. It's a very rare theory. I think only one person has brought that one up. And then the last one's my favorite, and I think the most credible, is that Jesus wasn't an alien. So if Jesus was an alien, and if you're an alien, you can do pretty much anything you want. And so he just, the resurrected Jesus was definitely the alien side of Jesus coming out and showing his X-Men powers, if you will, his alien powers and abilities.
Crucified in Roswell, by the way.
Yeah. So these are the alternative theories that we have to explain the facts, to explain this group of evidences that are available to the world. And I wonder, we were going to cover this, but I didn't want to go into too much detail. But I wonder what your take is on some of these ideas. Does any one of them sound more credible than the others, perhaps? Yeah, Chris.
Oh, what's the disciples stole the body? I hear that one most common when in discussion about it. I guess there was guards guarding the tomb, correct?
Yeah.
Romans guard, right? How many? Do you know?
We don't know. Let's say a small contingent of 10. That's probably reasonable. Probably a reasonable number.
2 or 3? You believe 2 or 3, or do you believe 10?
Let's just say something like
I
that.
believe 2 or 3.
But go ahead. Go on.
No, I'm just curious because they always say that they fought them, but I've always heard Roman guards to be one of the best fighters ever.
Okay.
And during that time, they were the strongest army of that era.
Okay.
So to have regular fishermen.
Here's a question. Let's just play with that idea. If the disciples came and overran the guards, do you think they could have done it? Could they have gone past them? 12 disciples, maybe 3 guards?
Well, they would have had to kill the guards. Otherwise, the guards would have reported what had happened.
Okay. So they're probably not likely to kill the guards, given their
Pilate did that
background.
later.
Other thoughts on this, or another alternative idea? Yeah, sure. Let's go here, Caroline.
What?
Caroline?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
okay. I think that, initially, there would be Roman guards, maybe 10 of them. And after some hours went by, we're looking at whether it was Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, whatever day.
Yeah.
Let's say Good Friday, whatever.
Uh-huh.
Saturday, things calm down, it's guarded, and so the guards think, well, they want to go home, and so it gets down to maybe 2 or 3.
Okay.
And Jesus decides to rise when they're tired and they want to sleep. Now that's interesting. 4 in the morning, let's say. Depends on when a day starts. Okay. Jewish day starts at sundown. Our understanding of a day starts at midnight or in the morning. See, different people have different versions of when a day starts.
Sure.
But I'm sure that most people at that time frame, because it's dark and they would sleep by night,
Okay.
would probably they did perhaps fall asleep. That's
Okay, interesting. These are really interesting ideas. I think you guys are kind of touching on something
Why do
good.
you think it was 10 guards?
Oh, I just thought he had a story he was trying to build up, so I was just giving him a number.
Caiaphas asked Pilate for guards, for Roman guards, not for Jewish guards, not for the Pharisees. So if he asked for them, then Pilate would not have put 10 guards just to guard one dead man.
Okay. Yeah, could.
Say somewhere in the Bible that,
No, you're good. You're good.
doesn't it say somewhere in the Bible that they knew that, let's put lots of men there because they might try and steal the body? It says something like that.
Perfect. You guys are awesome. Let's go into the scripture together. If you have your smartphone, can you go to Matthew 26? While you're doing that, let's see. You have a question in the back. Okay. And was there a question here? Wayne, you got a question? No. Okay. Question?
Well, there's a lot of problems. The tomb was sealed.
Yeah.
The tomb was sealed.
Mm-hmm.
The stone was way too heavy for them to move.
Mm-hmm.
It was way too hard to.
Matthew 28, sorry. This 28. 28, 11 through 15. Go
It
ahead.
was way too heavy for the disciples to have moved the stone if it wasn't sealed, but
Yeah.
it was sealed.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of things to overcome.
Yep.
The Roman guards would not have gone to sleep. They would have not gone on vacation because they had a job to do, and if they didn't do it, they would be killed. They would take this job very, very serious, and they would not allow anybody to steal anything because their life is at stake.
That's right.
And they are the premier fighters, and
Yeah.
they had the premier weapons, and you're not going to overtake the Roman guards anyways. So there's way too many obstacles to overcome, and mathematically, statistically, I mean, is it an absolute fact? I don't know, but statistically, it's a fact that could not possibly ever happen.
Okay, very good. Let's read this together. I want you to put on your historian glasses here, and we're going to go back into the outline because there is a section I have for you on this, and I'm glad you brought this up because this is an alternative theory, I think the only one that we really need to look into tonight. There's, again, in the notes, I provided you with my thoughts on all of these and some thoughts for you to cruise through later on and use. But this is the one that's worth spending time on. So who would be willing to read Matthew 28, 11 through 15, nice and loud? Okay, nice and loud, please.
It's the report of the guard. While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priest all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day.
Thank you. So, what do we have here? We have an alternative theory developing on the morning of the resurrection, essentially. So, like right after it happened. So the guards, essentially, after the resurrection took place, they went back and they went to the chief priests. And they said, hey, this is what happened. Jesus resurrected. Angels were there. The stone was rolled away. What do you want us to do? We're gonna get killed. Pilate's gonna be really upset. So the chief priests say, we're gonna ask you to lie, and we're gonna give you some money to do it, and you're gonna look bad momentarily in front of your supervisors, but we'll vouch for you, and we'll say good things about you, and we'll smooth it over, because we got some pull with them. And so they basically say, take this money and say that the disciples came and stole the body while you were asleep at night. And they said, if it gets to the governor, we'll smooth it over with the governor. So the soldiers took the money and they go off and they do as they were instructed. And it says, this story has been widely circulated amongst the Jews to this very day. And amongst ourselves to this very day. Isn't that interesting? So here's what essentially happened in the aftermath. The Christians go around and say, hey, people on the street, guess what? Jesus is alive. And the Jews would have responded and said, no, he's not. The disciples stole his body. That's the rumor that they would have heard. The Christian then would have said, no, you don't understand. There's a guard at the tomb that would have stopped any disciples from coming to steal the body. And the Jew would have said, the guards were sleeping. Hello, everybody knows that. The rumor we got told us. The Christian would have said, no. The chief priests bribed the guards to say this, and the guards fainted when the angel came. That's what actually happened. And it turns out that this debate is actually something that we still do now. We go through the same sort of thing. And there are some interesting other facets to this. One, the tomb was in the way, so it's pretty difficult for people to move this. The stone in front of the tomb was still there. And the other thing is that the guards were, it's highly improbable that they were sleeping. The disciples walked past them, tippy-toe past them in a little garden out front of the tomb, move a big old stone without waking them up, pull out the body without waking them up,
And put the stone back.
and then wander off with Jesus' dead body. That's highly improbable. It's also highly improbable that they overtook the guards in a battle scene, sort of thing.
In Acts of the Apostles, Peter was taken out of the prison. The angels came and struck the guards.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have, interestingly, kind of a breakout session with Peter a little while later that is kind of similar. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Let's go back here. Yeah.
I was gonna ask something from, I think, a couple weeks ago. Remember when the two women came with like embalming or whatever it was? And I know there's a lot of criticism, like, what were they, there's, with the stone, like, how do we intellectualize? I mean, do you know what I mean? Like, you're not gonna get in unless it wasn't what we thought, that it was sealed off and stuff.
Oh,
And
I
know
see.
It's kind of the same. You
Yeah,
know,
when they came Sunday morning to
just the
try
two,
to.
remember, with not the other women?
Yeah.
A lot of criticism about, like, well, either the stone wasn't as big, and so it could have been easily moved, or what were they doing there with those, I don't know if it's embalming or not. So,
Yeah.
have you heard that, or?
Yeah, I haven't actually. It's an interesting idea.
I think Geisler has something on it, but I don't.
Okay, I'll have to check
But
that out.
It's a pretty good question, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, why were they going there in the first place if they couldn't get in? If the tomb, if the stone was too big?
Timing of, you know,
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Let's go here. Yeah.
and then also, the women would have had to roll the stone because they saw Jesus first, right?
Well,
The disciples.
that's a good question. I think what we find is that the stone was already rolled away. Yeah. But Jesus didn't need that to happen either. He could have just transported him through the wall, transported himself through the cave wall. So, yeah, let's go here.
Why do you think it was such a surprise to the disciples that he was resurrected?
Oh, that's a great question. If you don't mind, I'd like to cover that after the break because we will spend a lot of time on that. So that is a great question.
The
Yes.
scripture says that the guards told the Jews what had happened. I mean, that's what the scripture says. So if the Jews they don't want to accept that, what do they want to accept? That the guards were asleep or something else? But yet they're willing to accept the bottom part, that the guards should lie. And how can you take one part of it and not the whole thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Good point. Yes, let's go. Oops. Woo! Sorry. Did I scare anybody? Let's go here. Yeah.
So the question or the passage that was just read aloud, so how do you think that the writer got that information? Because we're talking about like a private conversation between the guards and the Jewish high priest. Who else was there that would have been able to record that?
That's a great question. I can't answer that.
Jesus appeared 40 days after. They told to relay as much information as possible. It's the same kind of context as to when Jesus was speaking with Plato, or is it Plato? Who is it that he was speaking with in the room by himself? That he says that what is truth?
A pilot. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, it's time to Plato too.
Pilot, Plato, same thing.
It's the same situation. It could be related during some sort of dialogue in between.
Yeah, I have a feeling that a lot of the content we have in the Gospels, we have through the oral transmission, but how did we get some of these private conversations like that one and others? That's a great question, and usually, and maybe a good hypothesis is that Jesus informed the disciples of these details out in the aftermath, and that's how the oral transmission of the story propagated through the ages until it was written down. Caroline.
Oh, yeah. Well, my question that I'm thinking of, was Jesus mutant? In other words, on the road to Emmaus, there was someone that joined, Ananias, or what was his name, and the other fellow, we don't know, but they found out later he disappeared. When they recognized him, he disappeared.
Yeah.
And then when he stood on the shores of Galilee, for Peter, what did he look like then? And what did he look like when he appeared to his disciples? And what did he look like after he resurrected? There's all these different figurines.
That's a great point. When we're looking at Jesus' body and the aftermath of the resurrection, especially then, we're really dealing with the trans-physical body. I think we talked about this last week a little bit, where it's essentially the type of body we'll have in some way when we resurrect. And he has this body that can do mutant sort of things, yeah. So like transport himself or go through walls, things like this. But that's, I don't think, too big of a deal to contemplate if he's God of the universe, you know. Yeah, let's go here.
Did he say ask Thomas to touch his hand because Thomas didn't want him?
Yeah, so that's a great point. The body had to be physical in nature to be felt, to eat the fish on the seashore, that next in the aftermath there, and he had to be physical in nature to be doing that sort of stuff.
You were saying he has a resurrected body, but why didn't he tell Thomas to go feel like to touch his hand or something? Didn't he say like to touch where he got
Yeah,
nailed?
yeah.
So does he have a new body or does he have that old body?
From what I understand, he has the same body, and he still has the scars and the holes in his wounds. But this is just, conjecture. No one could be certain on that. If the wounds were healed up in the transphysical body, or certain parts of his transphysical body have the wounds still. One thing I'd like to do is just conclude this topic here, this section, and have us realize that there are certain improbabilities with this theory that the disciples stole the body. There are many issues with it. What is interesting here, though, in the dialogue that we see in the Bible, that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and all the other chief priests knew where the tomb was. Isn't that interesting? They knew where it was, and they put a seal on it. So this gives further evidence to what we talked about a lot last week of Joseph of Arimathea putting him in the tomb. So this is an extremely established fact that he was buried, and everybody knew where he was buried. In fact, they knew exactly where it was because they went to Pilate and said, "We need some guards at that place over there," and they put a seal on it, the chief priests themselves. And that seal would have reflected the idea that if anybody messes with this tomb, they have to answer to the chief priests. And no Jew, especially no defeated disciple of Jesus who's running for their life, is going to go mess with something that the chief priests sealed. And because they were already trying to get out of there. So that's something to keep in mind, is that these other theories, wrong tomb, unknown tomb, they just lack luster when you're talking about the extraordinary pieces of evidence that is readily available. The legend theory may have some credibility, but we'll talk more about why that would fail. Hallucination may have some credibility, but the twin one, obviously not. Existential and spiritual resurrection, not so much. And so these other ones, the swoon one, that one's been set aside, and various medical doctors have chimed in on this. One guy in the 80s wrote an account. He was a doctor of what it would have been like physiologically for Jesus to have gone through the crucifixion and the suffering beforehand, and how his body and biochemistry would have responded to the lashes in the back and different things. And so he basically was saying that no one could have survived this, and it's surprising that Jesus even made it to the cross because of the torture he endured. So these other theories, Jesus was an alien, it's just, we're really kind of running short on some good substantial theorizing here. And so I just want to bring these out to us to make us aware that the whole approach to history is trying to understand how to make sense of the data we have. And that's what we're doing. So the last theory that we offer is the supernatural theory that he was raised in bodily form from the grave. And this theory is the only one that makes sense of all of the facts, of all of the evidence. This one fits the evidence perfectly. It has the most explanatory power, the most explanatory scope. It's not ad hoc, and it fulfills McCullough's criteria for how to arrive at qualified explanations when you're doing history. And for more information on that, you could read William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith book. And he talks about the different criterias that are required for good theories: explanatory power, explanatory scope. It needs to be more plausible than its competing theories, less ad hoc than its competing theories, disconfirmed by fewer accepted beliefs than the competing theories. It significantly exceeds its rivals in fulfilling the previous conditions, and these sorts of things. So when you're doing history, you have a method. And what the problem with these theories is they just don't satisfy. They don't get through the process. So what are we left with? We're left with just a few good ones. This one, maybe that one, and that one. And really, when people debate this, they're really debating hallucination and legend, typically. They don't do the disciples stole the body thing. So really, you have kind of three that you come down to at the end of the day. And in my opinion, the other two just fail miserably in comparison. So, having said that, why don't we go ahead and take our break? When we come back, we're going to look at how to show the resurrection is the right theory. So we'll be back in 5 minutes. Now, given all of that, I wanted to make a couple clarifying statements if possible. The fact thing we were talking about earlier, when you hear a guy on the History Channel, as someone brought up during the break, and they say, this is a fact, blah, 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 and then they spew out a bunch of liberal garbage, you don't want to just walk away and say, okay, I guess that's a fact, and move on. Again, what they're trying to say is what the majority or the supermajority of scholars think about a particular topic. So now, when you are also using the facts that we went over, the 12 facts, you don't want to present them with that word. Again, that word is very confusing. We want to use the word evidence. When you're talking about how to show the truth of the resurrection, you don't want to say facts of history, fact, because that word really throws people off and makes people upset. So don't even go there. Just say, here's 12 lines of evidence, and what do we do with this evidence? And again, the alternative views are available for us to make sense of the evidence. Now, back to your notes there. We're going to pick it up on part of the argument where we say, essentially, that the evidences that we have provide a compelling case for a historical resurrection event, which is the theory with the most explanatory power and scope. So it's on page 42, I believe, after that big diagram that we just talked about. And we're right there at the top. So we're at the evidence the evidence provides a compelling case for a historical resurrection event, which is the theory with the most explanatory power and scope. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, of all the alternative competing theories, this theory has the most explanatory power and scope and makes the most sense of all of the data. So, how many evidences or facts do you need to show the resurrection? Well, one scholar by the name of Gary Habermas, he usually uses 5 of the 12 that we looked over at the beginning. His 5 are: Jesus was killed by crucifixion. Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them. Fact number 3, conversion of the persecutor Paul. And again, Paul, who had persecuted Christians, was converted by appearance of the resurrected Jesus. Fact number 4, conversion of the skeptic James. And fact number 5, Jesus' tomb was empty. And so what Habermas has done, like I mentioned last week, is since 1975, he's looked at all of these journal articles and all of these other scholarly books that people have written, the scholars have written, in French, German, and English, and he's compiled folks who are on the side where they would agree that there is an empty tomb versus those who would say there wasn't an empty tomb. And 75% of scholars would lean towards or conclude that there was an empty tomb. And so that's a very, very high percentage. And so the other ones enjoy higher percentages even. And so, point 7 there, from this minimal case alone, we can infer that the resurrection is the most plausible theory with the most explanatory power and scope, just from these 5 facts. You don't even need all 12. And so skeptical scholars do not like this argument because these are all facts that they agree on, but it leads to the conclusion that Jesus resurrected. Now, that's 5 facts. That's a 5 facts approach. What if you had only 3 facts? Could you still arrive at the resurrection as the best theory? Yeah, you can. Let's just say we only had these 3 facts in history, or only these 3 lines of evidences from the primary sources of history. Well, N.T. Wright and William Lane Craig have used these 3 facts in some of their approaches. Actually, Wright uses 1, but he depends on the other 2. And again, this is the book. N.T. Wright, he is one of the foremost scholars of our time. And I recently was told by an Oxford student I was hanging out with recently, he had done a little bit, has been exposed to some of the movements in biblical theological interpretation over the last 30 years in England, and he has said that it's because of one conservative Bible scholar by the name of N.T. Wright, sometimes people refer to him as Tom Wright, that a whole group of Bible scholars around England have become much more conservative rather than liberal. And that is huge, because what has happened in academia in the last 100 years is that scholars have moved far from conservative way into the liberal arena. And so because of his scholarship as a conservative Christian, he is influencing a good amount of liberal scholars in the UK. And that's just a huge deal. Now, this book is just an awesome, it's volume 3 of his books on Jesus, and just the scholarship in here is just world class. And Craig and Habermas and others all point to this book. So if you're going to study this material in the future, get this one to start with. It's The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright. So this is what everyone uses to work on their apologetics of the resurrection. And what Wright does and what Craig has done in the aftermath of this book, and Craig, again, William Lane Craig, he's done his own great research on the resurrection as well. It's just not as popularly published as this one is. But they use these 3 facts alone. The tomb was found empty. Experiences of post-mortem appearances of an alive Jesus occurred, and the origin of the Christian faith. The origin of the Christian faith. And so if you look at these three lines of evidence, you can easily arrive at the alternative theory that Jesus rose from the grave as being the best theory to hold to. And you could easily say that I'm a rational person, and this conclusion is based on a rational one, not a blind leap of faith, because of these three evidences alone. So each of these are factual in the same way other facts of history are established, through multiple independent evidences. So one asks at this point, what was the cause of the belief? Or how does one explain the origination of the belief that they experienced an appearance of the resurrected Jesus? Now, we want to be careful on how we talk about this. We don't want to say that all of them, okay, let me back up. When you start the conversation, you don't want to say with the skeptic person that all of them saw the resurrected Jesus if that person's a skeptic. You want to use the expression, they had an experience of the appearance of the resurrected Jesus, because no one's going to deny that. There's a difference. So if you say, I had an experience of the appearance of a resurrected Jesus, then everyone's going to agree. How do you explain the experience of the appearance is what the issue is. Everyone says, fact number 2 right there, experiences of the post-mortem appearances of an alive Jesus. Everyone agrees to that. Everyone thinks, all these scholars, they all agree that the disciples had an experience of the appearance of Jesus. And so that fact number 2 is very important. Now, how do you explain the experience of the appearance? That's the question. And how do you explain the origin of the Christian belief? So, point 7, the existence of the disciples' belief in the supernatural bodily resurrection of Jesus is basically uncontested fact among historians and scholars. And we're going to skip over that J.P. Moreland quote there and just move here to point 8, I believe. Scholar and theologian N.T. Wright concludes that we are left with the conclusion that the combination of the empty tomb and appearances of the living Jesus forms a set of circumstances which is itself both necessary and sufficient for the rise of early Christian belief. So what he's saying there is that with the empty tomb, with the appearances of Jesus, you put those together, and essentially together you have the necessary and sufficient conditions for the rise of belief that Jesus rose from the grave. Okay? Just from those two alone, you have the necessary and sufficient conditions. All right, so just moving through here, point 5 or V there, Roman numeral V. Thus, based on these circumstances, the best explanation is the resurrection caused the rise of belief. So again, you just take these two, you put them together, and all of a sudden you get the origin of the belief, fact number 5. So you put 1 and 2 together, you get number 3 as a result. Does that make sense? Now, 10, when taking Wright's and Craig's argument and massaging them for clarity and brevity, we get the following. Here's why you came to this class instead of reading the books. Primary premise. The disciples believed Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. That's what essentially Wright and Craig are saying. The disciples believed Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. That's the first premise. Secondary premise A. The belief could have been caused by seeing visions of the raised Jesus, meaning just a pure vision, not an actual Jesus, or seeing the actual resurrected Jesus in bodily form. So it's either one, they had a vision, and that's what their experience was, just a pure vision, like a dream, for instance, or they actually saw a resurrected Jesus. It's one or the other. Secondary premise B, the belief could not have been caused by seeing visions of the raised Jesus. So in the argument structure, you then have to provide evidence is for why secondary premise B is true, that the belief could not have been caused by seeing visions of the raised Jesus. So you deny that, and then you say the conclusion, thus they saw the actual resurrected Jesus in bodily form. So this is what Craig and Wright are doing in all of their writings and debatings and talks. So essentially, how do you explain the experience of the appearance of Jesus? Is it a vision or like a dream, or is it an actual appearance of the resurrected Jesus? And they say it couldn't have been a vision or a dream, because that doesn't make sense of all of the data. And so what we're left with is the actual bodily resurrected Jesus is the only conclusion available. You have two options. This is the only option. Now, they provide convincing evidence of the empty tomb and the appearances. And so they substantiate this argument quite well. Now, they go on to argue about why the hallucination is not a good theory, why vision is not a good theory, and that helps build the case. And so I'm just summarizing for you for the sake of time. And one thing to note is that on this point 13 there, is that the disciples did not in fact claim an exalted vision, but a bodily resurrection appearance. Okay, showing the truth of premise 3. So in other words, they did not claim that Jesus translated through time and space and appeared to them in a ghostly matter or in any other matter but a bodily resurrected form. And so this is very important because the exalted vision hypothesis, meaning that they had a dream that Jesus kind of became God out of the suffering and exalted himself, and it later on just continued to exalt himself through the ascension process. He's saying that doesn't make sense. That theory doesn't hold any weight because it doesn't make sense of all of this other data. What the disciples came up with was that he was resurrected. And the resurrection is something that is completely innovative. It was an innovative idea for the disciples to have come up with. So other ideas, this may be translation through space and time, that maybe some other Greek authors or some other ancient Near Eastern authors had come up with in some other literature, that didn't work because they actually came up with something entirely different than that, and it wasn't that. So essentially, Craig and Wright conclude, point 14, that the disciples' belief in the resurrection can only be caused, or is best explained, by the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead and they experienced his transphysical resurrected body. Okay, so what is starting to be clear is that we are left with only really one rational conclusion, given all of these lines of evidences that we've talked about. Now, there are other non-minimal, circumstantial, indirect evidence supporting both approaches that we talked about above with Habermas and Craig and Wright. And that's point C there. So we're going to look at a few other pieces of evidence that we haven't talked about yet. The first one, Roman numeral I there under C. The tomb where Jesus was laid was not venerated. So basically what we're saying here is that at certain times in the Jewish past, they would have venerated a gravesite. They would have put flowers around it, maybe built an altar if it was a really important person that died, and if that person was a significant figure in that culture. So during that time period in Palestine, it was customary for the Jew to venerate the tombs of holy men who had come and gone. And since Jesus was definitely a respected holy man, his tomb veneration would be expected. If they knew where the body of Jesus was laid, wouldn't they have gone to venerate the tomb? They did know where it was laid, but yet we find no evidence in history of a tomb being adorned with religious objects, nor do we find pilgrims going there annually to worship or to pray or anything like that. And there's all sorts of holy sites all around Israel. If you've been there, you know what I'm talking about, where people have built churches and built synagogues on top of each other. And, you know, it's just a big old deal. Everybody knows where certain things are. But at the tomb of Jesus, we don't have veneration over the years. Now, this lack of evidence is not a big deal. I mean, we wouldn't want to bring this up as full proof in and of itself. It does not prove much. But it just is another point that there's no evidence of veneration. And the point is that why wouldn't there be flowers and candles and all these sorts of things that they would have used? It's not there. Why not? Because Jesus' body isn't in there. And so again, you don't want to venerate a tomb when there's no body in there to honor, essentially. So again, point 7, the non-veneration evidence is more an argument from silence, so we have to be careful of that. We don't want to get caught saying that the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. I think I said that wrong. We don't want to say to others that absence of evidence is evidence of absence. So we don't want them saying that to us. So keep that in mind. So this is not a capstone point and needs the other points to add to the argument. So again, not a big deal, but it's circumstantial. So and once you start adding all this circumstantial evidence together, then your case becomes a little bit stronger and stronger with each piece of circumstantial evidence. Yeah, question?
So when you're saying the Jews here, is that the disciples, or is that, because I'm curious as to why would the Jews venerate a tomb if they didn't like it?
The disciples. Yeah. Or any Jewish person that thought he was an honorable man. You know, that may not have been a follower, but just figured he was a good teacher, sort of thing. Yeah.
Also, I just want to quickly point out that supposedly at 3 p.m. when Jesus died, there was that great earthquake, and that temple veil this thick was rent in two. And for something like that to occur is nearly impossible. And I know people in that time period would take occurrences in nature as almost signs of something supernatural, more than even today, because there's so many explanations for things. So there's a huge earthquake. The sky became so black that that's agreed upon. So it's like everybody would want to flee the area, go to their homes, make sure. It's almost like there was a vacancy of people running for fear. They wouldn't just hang around where Jesus died because of what happened. They'd be afraid.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, maybe that would deter you from going to the tomb, just because you think maybe lightning's going to strike you or something. Yeah, it's a good comment. One of the most exciting things I think about the circumstantial evidence is this idea of a innovative doctrine that had developed called the resurrection. So what we're saying here is that a modified doctrine of the resurrection developed, and it developed rapidly. So the idea of resurrection wasn't completely uncommon to the average Jew. They kind of knew what resurrection meant. And what did they mean prior to this? Does anybody have any idea of what resurrection meant to the Jew prior to the disciples proclaiming this one?
They like the last day resurrection. I think when Jesus made Lazarus resurrect, so the Martha or Mary was saying, we know that he will resurrect in the last day.
Exactly. Great point. That's it, essentially, is that the Jews had this understanding that resurrection meant that all will rise on the last day. And after that, God creates a new world, essentially. So when Mary and Martha were there, I think it was Mary who said, I can't remember which one, yeah, yeah, I know what you're talking about, Jesus. He'll be raised on the last day. But Jesus had other ideas, right? So the Jewish conception of the resurrection was held to be eschatological and non-individual and physical in nature, meaning that they thought of it at the eschaton, at the end. And it was not individual. It was corporate. We were all to be raised. That's the whole idea of resurrection. And so the Jewish belief always concerned the eschatological resurrection and not a resurrection within history. So it was always general with the people and not of an isolated individual. And different schools of thought were present in Jesus' day about the resurrection, but all of them agreed that it was physical in nature. So yeah, everyone agreed that we're gonna rise in a bodily form on the last day. Now, the multiple resurrection passages of the New Testament obviously reveal the radical, modified theology of the primitive early church. We have something very different there. The disciples believed they saw a resurrection, a bodily resurrection of Jesus, despite holding every predisposition, theologically speaking, to the contrary. So the Jews, the Jewish disciples, would have had that same theological idea prior to seeing Jesus' resurrected body, that we will all be raised on the last day. They still weren't expecting him to rise. They still had confusion, most of them. They still weren't sure what he meant when he said, in 3 days I will rebuild this temple. So what we're seeing here is that prior to the resurrection, for them, Jesus was dead. And Jews had no anticipation of a dying, much less rising Messiah. Now keep in mind this whole Messiah complex that Jesus gave. He clearly presented himself as the Messiah, time and time again. According to Jewish law, Jesus' execution as a criminal showed him out to be a heretic, a man literally under the curse of God because he was crucified with criminals. And the disciples were crushed that their Messiah had fallen. A resurrected Messiah did not fit in to their theological framework. The disciples were not expecting Jesus to rise. He was dead and they were crushed. They were in mourning, they were in despair, they were brokenhearted. All of their hopes and dreams were lost. Moreover, Jewish belief about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead before the general eschatological resurrection of the dead. Also in the Jewish worldview, resuscitation or translation would have been available theologically, and this would have grounded a term that the disciples could have used to describe the event. Resuscitation or translation concepts were not used by the disciples, despite that being a recognizable option. So we have theological options available for the disciples to employ. They didn't, though, because they experienced something much different than a translation or resuscitation. They knew of Enoch in the Old Testament being translated up to heaven. They knew of that story. And they could have employed that story, that sort of terminology in their preaching of the gospel. But they didn't. They used resurrection. They used a different thing altogether. They used the concept of this general rising of all of humanity at the last day. And they said that's what Jesus did in human history. And so, essentially, if you skip there to point 6, moreover, a common belief of the early church, also of post-Enlightenment thought today, was that dead people don't rise. And this helps define the new belief that the disciples had. Most people in our world, this post-Enlightenment culture we have, this postmodern culture, most people say dead people don't rise. If you're a Christian, you also say dead people don't rise. I mean, we're not crazy. We know people that are dead stay dead. except this one, except this guy. So if you cruise down a little further, point 7, N.T. Wright clarifies that with the meaning of resurrection in the theology of Second Temple Judaism, it would be impossible for such a reshaped resurrection belief to emerge without a dead person coming back to life. In other words, the disciples presented a modified doctrine of the resurrection. What explains that modified doctrine? It cannot be anything else but that Jesus bodily rose from the grave. Point 9. The modified resurrection doctrine included the nature of the body, was a continuation of the body prior to the crucifixion, but with transphysical properties. This is the body type which we will later inherit. It will be suitable for heavenly existence. And we talked about that a little bit. Essentially, what we're saying here is that the disciples came up with something entirely new, entirely fresh, and entirely confusing to the Jews of their time. And so, point 11, what soon developed was the notion of shared victory and glory in dying for the cause of Christ, and the Christian should consider it pure joy and honor to be persecuted in the name of Jesus. Why? Because essentially those persecuted, those suffering, would be able to experience what Jesus did, and if they were to die, they would be able to experience the resurrection too. And it gets even better than that, because Paul tells us that we have the resurrection power in each of us through the ministry of the Holy Spirit. So now we're dealing with a whole new flood of ideas coming to us in the here and now through the resurrection. It is this thing that we can incorporate, this resurrection power. The power that raised Jesus from the dead is now available to those who are followers of him. This is extraordinary. What in the world? Where are they coming up with this? Translation couldn't have done it. A swooned Jesus who faked his death, who rose, but he never died, with all of his wounds, with all of his cuts, with all of his scars, that could not have produced this modified, powerful theory of the resurrection, this new theological doctrine. So point 12, the theological tides eventually turned from just accepting the modified doctrine of the resurrection to a theology of the afterlife and dying for the reason why one accepts it. So now people are saying, not only do I accept this view, but now I'm going to live with the resurrection in mind. I'm going to live with the resurrection power flowing through me. 13, thus the disciples' belief cannot be explained in terms of antecedent Jewish resurrection theology. So when we say, what was the thing that the disciples preached? What was it that they were telling people about? It wasn't just that Jesus was the Messiah. It wasn't just that he was God. It was also, and mainly, primarily, that Jesus conquered death, that he rose again. The resurrection was the primary and core point of the preaching in the early church, and that's this next point. The disciples preached the resurrection. That is what they preached. It was the point, and this is very, very important. Let's skip down to point Roman numeral 4, Jewish converts turning to new practices and embracing social changes. Now again, this is circumstantial evidence, but enough circumstantial evidence makes a very compelling case. And it's easy to be convinced when you start listening to all this circumstantial evidence. That Jewish converts started turning to these new practices and embracing social changes. Jews were all about traditions, laws, and old religion. But we see a social earthquake where 10,000 Jews abandoned centuries of practice within 5 weeks of Jesus' death. What was essentially the epicenter, if you will, of that quake? Where was that? What do we point to that would cause such a social change in their lives, in the society, where 10,000 Jewish converts came about very quickly after, relatively speaking, after the resurrection? Sunday became the primary day of worship, taking of the Eucharist, the body and blood of Jesus, the Last Supper. This was a celebration of his continued presence with us. Baptism's new meaning, death to self, raised to new life. People were sharing their belongings. There's the rise of a triune God theology within the background of strict monotheism. You have the use of a new liturgical book called the Didache for conducting services. And Jews adopting this new social changes of Christianity they ran the risk of being rejected by their families and eternal damnation if they were wrong. They needed to be firmly convinced that Christianity was based on solid foundations before converting, and the resurrection is the only valid explanation. So how do you explain all of these monumental changes in the social structures of these Jews who converted? What would possess them to change their life and risk being ostracized by their entire family and culture, and adopting this triune God theology when for millennia the Jews believed in strict monotheism? To take the Eucharist, such a cannibalistic activity according to many Jews of the time. It would have been very strange and cult-like for them to do that. What explains the change in the social structures for these converts? Only a bodily resurrection could explain that. And then point 5 here, the strong emergence of the underground church. You have, and scholars again all agree to these circumstantial pieces of evidences that I'm bringing up here. These are not contested evidences of history, facts of history. These are things that everyone agrees about. So the strong emergence of the underground church. We all know the church started, and it started with a passion. It went out, it kind of came out swinging, if you will. The 1.1 there, the despair of the disciples after the crucifixion would have amounted to the dissolution of the 12 and other followers in spite of the unprecedented and powerful teaching of their slain leader. It seemed then that Jesus' followers must have experienced something unique. They must have had something monumental to rock the world. The emergence and continual advance of the Christian church suggests an origin point that ceaselessly fulfilled their flame for their entire lives. It's fueled their flame for their entire lives. So essentially, what's happening here is there's this energy, there's this passion, there's this rage, if you will, there's this explosion, there's this fire in their bones that they must tell the world about what has happened. And the church begins and grows out of this passion of the disciples. Where do you get that kind of passion from? What would cause that kind of energy? Especially undergoing persecution. Point number 2, the church endured persecution for not participating in rituals to Caesar or claiming Caesar is God. Yet it grew due to this core message. In light of the brutal circumstances its followers faced, the successful expansion of Christianity is remarkable and uncanny. It appeals to any historian as a significant, persevering movement which had to be founded on a life-changing, monumental event. And so we can go on here to talk about how Christianity was birthed against all odds. You had this drive from the Roman centurions, the Roman governors, the emperors, to worship the gods of Rome or worship the Caesars as gods. The Christians did not bow, they did not worship, they faced the persecution because of it. What would give them that kind of endurance amidst persecution? The only thing that makes sense is that the actual resurrection occurred, and they were telling the world about it, and they were willing to face the persecution because they knew it to be true. And this last point, point 6, the disciples died for their beliefs. The disciples died for their beliefs. Again, scholars all agree on this. Point 1, the eyewitnesses of the resurrection went to their deaths not in virtue of their unwillingness, but inability to deny the bodily resurrection. How could they deny what they knew to be true? You can't deny it. When you have that kind of experience, when you actually see the resurrected Jesus, it's undeniable. So the actual seeing the bodily resurrected Jesus caused the belief. The Jesus they ate with at the Last Supper was the same Jesus they ate with on the beach after he rose from the grave. And the disciples were transformed from doubters to bold proclaimers of his death and resurrection. And after a couple disciples died, they realized the hardships, persecutions, and executions were coming if they didn't deny the resurrection. They were ridiculed, beaten, imprisoned, tortured, eaten alive, burned to death, beheaded, crucified, stoned, etc. But they did not waver. And people will die for their religious beliefs, like we talked about last week, if they sincerely believe them to be true. But people won't die for their religious beliefs if they know their beliefs are false. So what would possess hundreds and thousands of Christians to go to their death, especially the disciples, knowing that it was a lie? It does not make any sense at all. J.P. Moreland offers this quote. I think we shared it last week, but I'll put it here again. The disciples were able to see with their own eyes, touch with their own hands. They were in a unique position, not to just believe Jesus rose from the dead, but to know for sure they had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And so we can wrap up with that essentially, with this final thought in bold there in point D. Thus, we see that the evidence provides a compelling case for a historical resurrection event, which is the theory with the most explanatory power and scope. The minimal facts approach, the circumstantial evidence, all of these things help us arrive at this conclusion. So in conclusion, we can be confident and have certainty that Jesus lived, died, and resurrected. And so there's more to talk about there. Is it a watertight deductive proof? No, it doesn't need to be. It's a powerful, compelling, inductive argument based on solid historical evidences that we have available to us. And that's all we need. That's all we need. Is it enough to base our life on it? Yeah, more than enough. In fact, this evidence is so rich, it's hard to find anything else like this in history, especially from that era. And so I would just invite you to ponder the idea of what faith is. Rick Warren was talking about this recently. I don't go to Saddleback, but I thought he brought up some good points. This daring faith he was talking about recently. What is it to have daring faith? What is it to say that we're going to go live our life with the resurrection working its way through us, changing us, moving us? This is, I think, what faith is all about. It's the idea that we are trusting in an active way in something we know to be true. So when you read Hebrews 11, the heroes of the faith, it talks a lot about what they did. And they did these things. Abraham went out and did these great things, and David and all of these characters of the Old Testament, because they were able and willing to act on something they knew to be true. And so, again, Christianity is not a blind faith. It's based on all of this evidence that we have in history. It's based on a historical event. It's based on the resurrection of Jesus. And the great news is we have almost a window back in time to see it for ourselves with all of this data. We can piece it all together and kind of reconstruct it and realize what actually happened. And this is the exciting thing about Christianity, is that it's based on reality, and it's the best way to live, I think, to live the Christian life. It's the most exciting adventure I think anybody could possibly be on, and we have nothing short of a miracle in terms of the evidence available to us to substantiate our claims. So having said that, I hope you've found the resurrection to be at least interesting, but hopefully this argument compelling for the resurrection of Jesus as the best way to understand the data of history. And I guess with that, we can conclude this class session and these 6 weeks. So thank you so much. Thanks. So I'll be in touch with information about classes coming up. And if you're on Facebook, find me and I'll point you to this little group that we have there for these classes. And please stay in touch and send me emails and questions. I'd love to hang out and interact. All right, so hopefully you'll say bye to each other and see you in a few months.